All right. Hey, everybody. Today we're doing something totally different, totally new. And I'm really excited about this. And so first to introduce my two guests. Most of you know Matt Warder from Seawolf Research, who has done an enormous amount of content and with me in various forums. And we've been talking quite a bit about the commodity cycle, but more specifically about how search interest in macroeconomic analysis can kind of predict what promotions or thematics are going to work for promotion, which has kind of been an amazing upgrade to how we think about building promo. But I'm really excited to have a friend and former client of mine, Robert Price, who is the CEO of Total Helium, with us today. So Robert, thank you so much for being here. Matt, thanks for coming back.
My pleasure, bud.
Well, I just want to say, John, thanks for having me on. It's truly a pleasure. And Matt, good to see you again, too.
You too, Robert.
And just to kind of just drive into this, everybody, the conversation today is about kind of summed up with that great line from Mark Twain. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And so with the changes in the promotional environment in the industry, with things like the FTC coming in and kind of making income claims and other things harder to do, and the 10,000% return promises and all those things going away, we know that story-driven copy is very, very important now, and that's kind of one of the mainstays of the industry. And so, what I want to do today is I'm going to bring up a promotion from a good friend of mine, John McCrae, who wrote this promotion back, and it was post 2008. It was a couple years after. It was an uncertain market, and you can see how the storyline of that promotion rhymes with something big that's happening today. And then what I want to do is show you how the news stories of today, especially around things like the reshoring of the semiconductor industry into the US, drills down that story from the news headlines. And there's a ton of different entry points into that, from the CHIPS Act to just the $100 billion, I think there's 5 semiconductor manufacturers that are building massive kind of plants here. How that drills down into a specific sector, industrial gases and specifically helium, and then how that story then goes down into the opportunities for a really great individual company. And so the reason that we're doing this is I think the editorial teams and copywriters, especially junior copywriters, really need to start to think and learn again how this process that was always kind of the backbone of, I would say, the publishing industry for years, how that works, because we haven't had to be in that environment. So with that, the first thing I want to do before I start diving into all of the meat with Robert and Matt is I'm going to share my screen real quick, guys. And what I want to do is, okay, so I actually have the Word doc this was written by John McCrae. And so it was before May 12th, or May 2012, because you can see that in the headline. And you can see this great headline. It was remade in America. This promo did, I think, it's like 40,000 to 50,000 front-end units at the time. It was a phenomenal story, phenomenal promo. And it was a time when most other things weren't working that well. There wasn't a lot, right? And what this story did was essentially talk about the reshoring of manufacturing overall in the US at the time, which was a big thing in the news. And it drills down through this storyline into specific sectors. And so I don't want to get into all the details of this promo, and I will post a copy of this for people to review. But I want to take this idea of a remade in America story, which ironically, when Matt and I were talking about doing this, we noticed that Porter Stansberry had a new promo, and all the email copy was talking about an American revival. And so we're already seeing that, again, history rhymes. And I'll post this promo for everyone to review. But with that kind of idea that you have this in times of uncertainty, and especially in the geopolitical times, we have this very pro-American kind of manufacturing story that's happening in the semiconductor space right now. And we can see that there are promos that you can look at from the past that we know worked amazingly well. And that can serve as inspiration for a new story that then needs to be kind of developed around the current specifics of what's actually happening in the economy right now. And that's where we get to the semiconductor plants, and we get to helium and down into Robert's story. So I'm going to stop sharing. And with that introduction, thanks for your patience, guys. Why don't we start with how do we think about the big news stories and the impact of the reshoring of semiconductors first and foremost? Matt, Robert, like, what are your thoughts on that, and what does that kind of mean for you guys?
Yeah, well, I'll take the sort of macro picture there, right? So we're if we think back to COVID, COVID is sort of the analogy for the global financial crisis in the scope of this example, right? That promo came out in 2012. That's about 3-4 years removed from the crisis. Now we're in 2023, about 3 years removed from the crisis. And if we think about how GDP and inflation fared in those months and weeks afterwards, we had this massive deflationary event, and then followed by a whole lot of stimulus, which worked its way out into the market, and then gradually over time, although there were cycles within those few years, in general, GDP began to rise again. We began to reflate. We're now at a point in time where, just from a macroeconomic perspective, where we've lapped the easy comparisons year on year. So we had the lowest GDP in history. Well, next year that was followed by the highest rate of change in GDP in history. Same thing for inflation. And now we're on the other side of that, where inflation's coming down, GDP is slowing, and we're going to hit an equilibrium over these next couple of years and begin rising again. That's the similarity in background between now and then. So there's always a legislative or regulatory component to that, because when you have these crises, Congress reacts, and this time is going to be a little bit different in how we have Democrats in office, mostly controlling the Congress, whereas back in 2008 we had Republicans sort of heading into Democrats, and Democrats had a supermajority. So the ability to sort of get things done, at least here for the next 2 years, is a little bit questionable because of this mixed Congress. That said, we've already passed some pieces of legislation that are already in place to provide for some semblance of onshoring or nearshoring, and that's driven by what COVID laid bare, which is the risks that come along with just-in-time supply chains. And a lot of that supply, of course, goes through China, either from a processing perspective or from a raw materials perspective at all. And we've seen that if we want access to medicine, access to semiconductors, access to whatever it is we're talking about, to some degree we're going to need to deglobalize access to raw materials and bring some of that production sort of onshore. And there are two key pieces of legislation, at least in my estimation, that exist right now. One is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is pertinent to the energy industry, which will encourage investment in either EVs or batteries or solar or wind or potentially nuclear in some of these areas that were in middle America that were kind of left for dead during the regulatory increase under the Obama administration. But the second one is a real kind of manufacturing boon, and that's the CHIPS Act. So with all the geopolitical IP risk that is associated with Taiwan and the conflict between China and Taiwan sort of escalating, there is a desire by the government to sort of pull some of that manufacturing back on shore. Now the risk there is that we have yet to sort of reshore the raw materials that are associated with semiconductor manufacturing. And with the example that we're putting forth today, one of the critical elements for semiconductor manufacturing happens to be helium. Helium is necessary to provide the inert environment that's needed for the lithography phase, specifically of semiconductor manufacturing. And I think as far as total global helium demand by sector, I think semiconductor manufacturing is about 15, maybe as much as 20%. As we move on into the future, it's really the only sort of arm of helium demand that's increasing over time. So
before we jump that far, I want to take a moment to point out something about the fact that this conversation and these trends and this investment on the ground is being impacted and driven by very specific legislation, because there was a type of promotion that we would do, and we would see it a lot in this industry because it worked so well. And it would literally take the bill, which in this case for the CHIPS Act is HR 4346, and it would basically put that in the headline and then say that this particular bill is driving XYZ, right? It would be a market story that is very much putting the legislation front and center and explaining why that is basically the government is forcing a bull market in something. And that's exactly what the actual thing is happening right now. It's driving investment, and you have two different bills, right? And so it's almost like there's a race to see who does the promo first and who does it better. So if you're listening and you're a copywriter or a publisher, like the Inflation Reduction Act, HR 5376, and the CHIPS Act, HR 4346.
Yeah, just for real quick, just where these new facilities are being built for the CHIPS Act is Intel, Ohio, $20 billion, Taiwan Semiconductor, Arizona, $20 billion, Texas Instruments, Texas, $30 billion, Global Wafers, Texas, $5 billion, and then Samsung, Texas, $17 billion. I mean, that's just incredible investment that is using part of the CHIPS Act as for the investment.
And that's actually, so like, think back to the numbers again, because the numbers that you just said, Robert, like you're talking about single facilities that are being built at 20 billion, like, and for everybody in this space, like, remember the cannabis boom? Like, you're talking about a $90 billion market. The market is 90 billion. And everyone was so excited about doing promos during that because it was working. But here you have like the size of this market is so much bigger, as evidenced by the fact that, there's probably more investment in new facilities in the US than the entire size of the cannabis market in the US. Like that gives you just a taste of the scale of this and why, as an investor or investment, would be interested in this. So thank you for sharing those numbers, because that's like kind of like it's stark.
Yeah.
Yeah. And from a copywriting perspective, I mean, what that investment outlines is, what I understand copywriters refer to as the force of nature that sits within, a copy. The element that forces companies to buy from certain sources, as opposed to others. That's selectivity. That is sort of inherently involved in the IRA and the CHIPS Act, preferring, specifically American, but also broadly, North American supply is one of the things that we think is going to drive, prices for that market going forward, as well as just the general supply scarcity. I think that's kind of an important thing to underline. It's like it's one thing that we need more. Helium specifically, in the U.S., but it's another that the end users are forced to buy or preferentially want to buy U.S. or North American production, right?
Mm-hmm. And John, I was going to mention, and Matt, I don't know about the article that you shared with all the viewers, John, but I did see one illustration of it looked like a well that was drilling horizontally, and this was during the shale revolution. And I'm a kid of the 70s, and I remember during the oil embargoes of the 70s, I was in my dad's 1959 Ford Blue station wagon, and we could only fill up gas at the station every other day, and there were lines in the station. And to think back then that the United States would somehow become independent of foreign supplies of oil and gas, and to think that maybe we would be an exporter of oil and gas was unheard of back then. But now we truly are independent from those foreign supplies of oil and gas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. That's a great point, because it wasn't something that we ever thought would be possible. And you're right, that promo did very specifically drive into the shale kind of story. And so I think that, and there's a lot of there's obvious parallels now between that story and this story, and the number of entry points for both an editorial team and a copywriter into these kind of stories are just abundant, because you have the semiconductor manufacturing story, you have the geopolitical issues around Russia and the transformation of the global supply chain that's happening, and there's 100 ways into that story geopolitically, and so I do think that this is like, and it's an ongoing story, which I think is important, right? These are not things that are basically like a 3-month story, and that's important. So if anybody who's younger in the industry, I think it was Brian Hunt, who's now the CEO of Investor Place, but he was one of the great editorial directors of the last 20 years. And he would say that you don't do front end promos in franchises around year-long ideas. Obviously, like, you need something that's going to be here for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, because when you have a promo that works, you're going to want to run it for as long as possible. And then Mike Palmer, who's actually coming to the event in June, is the other great copy chief, like legendary copy chief from Stansberry, and Kelly Brown is coming too, the current copy chief, who's also kind of a legend inside the industry for people who know. But Mike had a presentation one time where he talked about each promo is telling the next part of the story that hasn't been told, and so you're following a story like the semiconductor story, and you're updating your readers and followers with new promos that fit. What next? And so I think that's a really important piece of all this. And so before I copy geek out too much, because that's my tendency, why don't I let you guys, I think there's enough stuff about the macro view on why semiconductors, as an example, are coming here. But I bet most of us don't really have, and I know I don't, relative to you guys, and most people probably don't have an understanding, other than what you just said, Matt, about why industrial gases in general and helium in specific is such an important part of this whole story. Mm-hmm. Would you like? Sure. I don't know which one of you want to take that story, but like
the basics of it is that to conduct the lithography stage of semiconductor manufacturing, that has to occur in an inert environment. Helium is one of the noble gases that doesn't react with other chemicals. So, helium, argon, argon, I believe, is used in the laser that does lithography, but you need an atmosphere that's inert. So that's the important specifically for helium. And then, the other issue that we have in the U.S. is from a supply perspective. Back a long time ago, we had a strategic helium reserve that was based in the Hugoton Basin. So if we needed to pull additional supplies out, we could. Well, in the late 90s, I think it was during the Clinton administration, we passed the Helium Privatization Act of 1996, I think it was, which ordered basically the Bureau of Land Management, which basically managed the reserve facility, to sell crude helium from the helium reserve and transfer all those assets into private ownership. At that point in time, we were in the process of offshoring a lot of this production. Well, now the reverse is going to happen, and that strategic reserve is not necessarily there. And then the other sort of supply wrinkle is that a lot of global helium supply was sourced from Russia, and of course now with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, as well as there was a fire at one of the main export facilities in Russia early last year. That supply just doesn't exist on the global market. So global markets are inherently tight. But that's the kind of like high level background as to why helium is so important here right now. We have increasing demand in the United States and not enough supply necessarily to meet that, and no strategic reserve from which to draw. And those are the
editorial angles, phenomenal editorial angles around like the death of a strategic reserve, the private revival of a strategic reserve, like the storylines around that just like kind of write themselves.
Go ahead, Robert.
I was just imagine for a second, you're one of these semiconductor manufacturers. You're spending these tens of billions of dollars to build a facility. And you go to these industrial gas companies, you say, well, we want you to make sure that you have the helium at our facility on demand, exactly when we need it. And then your response as an industrial gas company said, oh, don't worry about it. We got companies are drilling wells. They'll find some more, or don't worry about it. We're going to go get it from Russia, or we're going to get it from Qatar. Don't worry about it. The logistics and putting in a cryogenic tube, send it over here. Don't worry about it. Then they'll say, well, do you have storage? Oh, no, we don't have storage, but don't worry about it. And that semiconductor manufacturers say, hold on a second. I need that at my plant on demand. And so it has these industrial gas companies scrambling. Why has Linde put millions of dollars into our exploration program? Why have they invested in us acquiring assets? Is because the pressure is on these industrial gas companies to perform. The supply chain, they're already planning that supply chain years out, and they want it to be there on demand.
Would you real quick explain who Linde is, just for everyone who doesn't know the company?
Yeah, Linde's the largest industrial gas company in the world. Their market cap ranges between 170 and 180 billion dollars, and they supply helium to, of course, semiconductor manufacturers worldwide, the space program, and one we're seeing another emerging is in quantum computing from helium's cooling properties. And so they have, from medical uses and so forth, they have, pressures on supplying it. What they do, John, is they usually sign long-term contracts. They have their own facilities on the plant site. And what's interesting is, they'll negotiate a price, but it has the flexibility to, if the commodity price goes up, they pass it through to their customer. And so they, of course, they're worried, concerned about buying the helium at a good price, but they do have those clauses that they can pass through to the customers. And just to let me put it in perspective from a pricing standpoint. If you're an oil and gas company and you're producing natural gas, that natural gas you receive at the wellhead anywhere from $2 to $4 an MCF right now. If you are a producer like Total Helium that is selling helium at the wellhead, we're seeing prices between $500 and $1,000 an MCF. It's truly extraordinary, what the price is for helium right now.
That's amazing. And just what's your relationship to you mentioned Linde in exploration. Could you just real quick lay out what that relationship is then?
Yeah, so we have a project in Kansas that they put millions of dollars in our exploration project, and then they encouraged us to go acquire more assets. So they introduced us to a gentleman. His name is Brad Butler. He has different helium fields. He sold us 50% of the helium field in Arizona. And this is the one field that is has significant production. Anyway, the only two companies that Linde has funded for helium exploration and production is Total Helium and Brad Butler. So we've known him for years, and we have a really solid relationship with him to work at producing the helium. And I'm just going to touch on for a second, John. I don't want to get too deep dive on our project until you're ready for it, but Linde on our Arizona acquisition. And I want to point out, just from a macro standpoint, Russia, Qatar, their helium fields it's a byproduct of liquefaction of natural gas. Their helium concentrations on their gas stream is 0.1%. So helium, I mean, I just want to show you the viewers right here. Of course, that's the periodic table. Mm-hmm. The number 2 is helium. Number 1 is hydrogen. We know that hydrogen's a small molecule, wants to escape, but boy, when they tried the balloon, was it the Hindenburg that blew up? I mean, it wants to escape, but it's flammable. Mm-hmm. Helium, as Matt pointed out, it's inert. It doesn't react. And so, but that little molecule element, it wants to get the heck out of the atmosphere as fast as possible. And so that's why it's a byproduct of oil and gas. It's 0.1%. It's 0.5% in the Hugoton, where most of the world's supply has come. And so what we chose to do as Total Helium is we acquired these helium assets in Arizona. They call this area the Saudi Arabia of helium. Why? Because the helium concentrations are 5 to 8%. It is truly world-class percentages. And so if you have a gas stream, you don't need a lot of it at $500 to $1,000 an MCF to be highly profitable.
All right. So this is why I love talking to you, Robert, and to Matt, and to people on the ground in these industries. Is like the stories are all over the place. So you got the Saudi Arabia of helium. You have the largest industrial gas producer in the world with facilities here in the U.S. who is obviously going to be supplying all these new semiconductor facilities, and they've only invested in 2 helium exploration companies ever, and you guys are one of them. And so like. And you're partnered with the other one, like you have a relationship. So like, it's the buyers are there, the demand is there, you have the supply, you're in the Hugoton, which was a natural gas field, which means that the infrastructure to transport everything is already there. So you're not building out this huge infrastructure that you would have somewhere else. You have higher quality helium locally, substantially higher quality helium locally than the existing supplies in Russia and Qatar and other places that were kind of supplying the industry. And we have a semiconductor manufacturing boom that requires it. We have a quantum computing boom that's kind of in process and starting that may also require it. And so like, you know, everybody, like, you see these big market stories down to sector stories, down to specific companies. These things are amazing if you have a great company to fit the story, not if you have like a great story and a crappy company. The business itself has to actually fit the full like chain, right? It has to be a real company that's doing real things. And I think this is where, just to like get on my soapbox real quick, this is where a lot of people fall down, is you realize you can get attention with a big topical story, but like the connections to whatever you just pick some stock that might theoretically fit it, that's not the same as having a storyline that like has very specific business elements that actually connect the entire chain. And when you have that, the story is so much more robust and interesting. Just in that high level few points that you dropped, I can just see so many different angles. Sorry to go off on a tangent again.
No, I think it's great. I just like the way your mind thinks as far as rolling out a story, John.
Well, we're publishing. We live and die by our ideas and our stories. And if we can't tell great stories, and we got lazy, all of us, myself included, when things were just booming, and you could just say like, here's a trading pattern, here's a black box system. Not that those promos have gone away, but like it's different. And I think that there's different types of customers that come in on great stories and ideas. And the best customers who spend the most money are the ones who really come in and engage with, I think, the ideas of the editor and the promo. And so we live or die by them. And so if we can't tell them well, and we can't really make the world that's happening outside come alive through the action of investing in the stories that we have, then like you don't really have a whole lot of you don't have a great business. And that's to me one of the core skills of publishing, or should be. But So from there, then, like, after that tangent, sorry, how do we pick that story back up then? So, Matt, I mean, should we dive into like all the things around this company?
Yeah, I think so. So, so we've laid out the big idea. The big idea is we're going to, we're deglobalizing. We're going to reshore manufacturing, specifically semiconductors. There are raw materials that go into semiconductor manufacturing that are critical to the process in and of itself, and it's critical for those new plants to have a domestic source, or at least a close to domestic source. We've established that the by and large the largest share supply is coming from one of three companies. Mostly it's Linde, which was previously mentioned, Air Liquide and APD. That's about 2/3 of global supply. There's also Matheson, Trigas, Messer, and Iwatani for another 28%, and then there's the volumes coming out of Qatar and Russia that are supplying the rest. The seaborne trade. There's only so much with regard to production, and we're going to need more, ostensibly, in more nearshoring over the longer term. So, when I've encountered this this same dynamic in other commodities, the characteristic that I tend to look for in equity is, one, who is the price rising over the next 2 or 3 years? I think that's going to be the case. If it's not rising, then we're going to be at least relatively steady at these historically high levels for helium. But secondly, you want to look for who's increasing production, into this price spike. I'm primarily a coal analyst. When that was happening, a couple of years ago, that was Arch Resources. And then as we moved into 2023, that became Consol Energy. So now when we're switching commodities over to helium, it's really, first of all, it's really hard to find any companies that are levered to helium, other than these big industrial gas companies, which are diversified. Mm-hmm. But secondly, you need to find ones that have projects that are up and coming. And through Robert's personal relationships that he's developed, as an executive over the years, he's put himself in a position where Total Helium is one of the few that's actually doing it. So for me, that's the initial big get, is that they're a producing facility. And with that, I'll turn it over to Robert to talk about some of the more kind of nuanced and important aspects of the company from there on out. But for me, that's the big one, is that you're producing now.
Yeah, and Matt, I think you touched on just pricing, and I know the pricing is fairly opaque. I remember when I was looking at opaque, I'm thinking, what does opaque actually mean? But it's a word that is it's not, you can't find it. You can't find what the pricing is. Why can't you find what the pricing is? Excuse me, all of these industrial gas companies, they go in and sign long-term contracts on the supply, and they don't advertise what their price is with other industrial gas companies. So there's no spot market for helium. And so what we chose to do on our acquisition in Arizona is we acquired the asset. We have our producing wells right now, but we had additional wells that were drilled and waiting to be hooked up to the helium processing facility. What did Linde do? They came in and funded the infrastructure expansion. And so they funded the pipeline hookup, and we built another 6 miles of pipeline. Linde funded that. Well, what does Linde want in return for funding that? They want a guaranteed supply and a guaranteed price. So in exchange for that investment, we agreed to sell to Linde for our first 10 wells, the helium at $500 an MCF. Well, why do we do that? Because right now, the spot market is between $500 and $1,000 an MCF. But what we did is, and this is all about managing our cash flow. It's not typical in oil and gas. You can go buy a hedge and you can hedge your production out. Here, what we chose to do is go ahead and commit are these 10 wells at $500 an MCF for a 1-year period, and our additional wells, which we're already drilling additional wells, we'll have over 20 wells in the next 90 days. Those we can sell on the spot market. And so, and it will eventually end up with Lindy, but we can sell it on the spot market for a higher price. So it's about managing cash flow. Could we have held out and not taken Lindy's money for the expansion? Sure. But the investment was important for us. And second of all, our partnership with Lindy, it solidified our partnership at the $500 an MCF, but we still have the upside of the price. And so that's one way we're managing our cash flow.
Makes a ton of sense. And so what else? So like if you were talking to if you're talking to a new investor who's interested in the company but doesn't know anything about it, like, are those the points that you're starting with? Is that what you're talking about? the fact that you have the Lindy relationship, that you have this production capacity, you are producing, you're expanding, you have a large land package.
You bet. You bet. And one thing we didn't want to do, and John, you mentioned we drilled some wells in Kansas. We discovered helium. We produced helium. But again, it was a byproduct of the Hugoton Basin. And so it was 0.5% of helium. What you need in that type of environment to drill more wells is you need a higher amount of gas stream, only being 0.5%. Why are we? And so when we went to Arizona, my board, they challenged me. They said, Robert, this is what we want. We want, first of all, we want to buy existing assets with current cash flow. Second of all, we want to be able to drill developmental wells. So you look back to the Permian example, I mean, it's a blanket shell. It's just blanket. I mean, you run the economics on what your payback here. Mm-hmm. So here we have a blanket sand. It's called the Shimmerup sand. And so it's a blanket sand that we can develop and control our cash flow. And then on top of it, they said, we want even more upside. And part of that upside is these sand channel wells, the ones that I mentioned that did $9 million in gross revenue at $500 an MCF in the first 3 years. Imagine we hit one of those sand channel wells again, which we will certainly hit one of the sand channel wells. And, John and Matt, I don't know if you want me to go into real detail of geology, or do you want me to spend maybe 3 or 4 minutes?
Yeah. Well, I mean, give us kind of talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old, because that's but yeah, that'd be great. Like an overview of
absolutely.
That. And the reason for everyone to why this kind of thing is important is again, like, the stacking of the story. Now you go from the business opportunities from the company down into, well, why is this company so good? And you're going into things like the geology if you're talking about something like helium. So
so if you look at the Permian Basin, which so many major oil and gas companies are drilling their shale wells, why? They're not taking exploratory risk. They're taking economic risk on what the price is and what their costs of extracting it are. And so here we have a blanket sand. So we expect each one of these wells to come on at 100 to 150, MCF a day in the blanket sand. Those wells, again, they will pay out in less than 3 months. So at $220,000 a well, you get your money back in 3 months, and then you have longevity of these wells for many, many years down the road. But along the way, we will hit some of these channel wells. So again, low risk, out of channel wells, we're going to develop the field there. The economics are they're truly incredible. But because helium escapes, it escapes from steel containers. It escapes in geological time. And that's the reason these fields, it has such a small percentage. Here in the Holbrook Basin, the basin was not deep enough. So the rocks were not cooked. They weren't cooked, so it's void of any hydrocarbons. So it's literally a basin that just has helium, nitrogen, and there's a CO2 field. So it's about deep below. Helium is generated through the degradation of thorium and uranium and slowly migrates up and gets trapped. Well, it still gets out in these traps. It still wants to go to the atmosphere. So what we're doing right now, we're shooting a soil sample. The soil sample delineates where the sand channel wells will be. And so we are, with our ongoing program of drilling, we know we're going to get the blanket sand. We know the economics are good on the blanket sand, but the two wells that we purchased an interest in that are producing right now, I'm going to say it one more time. It did 250,000 MCF in 3 years at $500 an MCF. That's $9 million in gross revenue. If we sold that for $1,000 an MCF, that's $18 million in gross revenue. And our economics are not even run on that. But with the soil sample that we're shooting right now, we're going to be able to delineate those. And can you just imagine doing a few of those wells? And I feel very confident that we are going to hit those sand channel wells. So again, low risk drilling with incredible upside. But I think what it comes down to, John, it's cash flows. It's cash flows. You can have the best story in the world, but if you're not backed up by those cash flows, and when we did this acquisition, what was our criteria? We want to buy existing assets. So that's why we bought interest in currently producing wells. We want low risk drilling opportunities, and we want great upside. We have all those, and that's what we're backing up our business with concrete cash flows.
Wow. That's amazing. I think that so wait, just so I understand the technical detail here, with helium coming up to the surface, basically, are you then this low risk drilling then compared to other types of drilling is you can actually measure essentially surface sand? It's and see if there's some kind of helium present. So you don't have even drilling to look like, there's something there just by doing surface tests.
Yeah, it's actually incredible. It's incredible doing soil samples. Now, there's been natural gas fields. There's been oil fields that have been discovered with oil seeps that over time come to the surface. Natural gas fields have been discovered. There's subsurface geology, there's seismic, there's so many different tools that you use. But one indication for natural gas is soil samples that show over geological time it leaking to the surface. And you drill down with an auger, you get the sample of the soil, and you can see that's just very small, like a millionth of a particles. You just see a little bit of helium. Well, if you get one sample here and one sample here, this one will show the blanket sand, and then you can delineate where the channel sand is. And again, helium, it wants to get the heck out of here. And so over geological time, you can high grade with those soil samples where those sand channels might be.
Wow, that's really cool. So you have cash flowing assets, you have the offtake partner in Lindy, you have lots of room on the exploration side. And so, I mean, what are the other things about the company that are like story or that like if somebody who wants to like think about this as a story, what else, what are some other angles and things that are important for them to know besides the cash flows, the partnerships, the location, the big stories, like the supply demand sides there?
Well, I just from a personal standpoint, I've built some businesses. I'll just give you one example of a business that I built. And Matt knows a little bit of this background. Two engineers, they had a concept of taking an old coal-fired power plant, and Matt, you being in the coal, you know it well, the Escalante. When I mentioned it to Matt said, Escalante? What we did, we entered into a letter of intent to acquire this coal-fired power plant. And the concept was to, instead of burning coal, let's generate hydrogen on location. Let's use the hydrogen to generate the electricity. It's on-demand supply of electricity. If you think of, what happened in Texas 2 years ago with the wind turbines freezing, the wind, if you don't have wind or they freeze, you don't have electricity. And then with all the wildfires in the West, what happens to solar panels? It literally chokes out the generation of electricity. And so to have a power plant that's on demand is so important in our overall electrical grid. And so, but when you make hydrogen to make electricity, you have CO2 and you have emissions. So what did I do with my oil and gas background? I did the studies for sequestration. So we took the CO2, we sequester it underground, and that was the business model. You get a little more premium for the electricity because it's there's green, blue, but it's blue hydrogen, electrical generation. The only problem on that project, we needed about $600 million to bring it to life. And so what I did is I had 75% of the company. I sold my stake in the company to a company named Tallgrass. Tallgrass is funded by Blackstone, and they are now advancing this project, and they have very ambitious plans to not only make the hydrogen. They already have offtake agreements for the hydrogen, and they will be shipping through ammonia and even worldwide ammonia on tankers to use it as an alternative fuel source for coal-fired plants. Again, backed by the largest private equity firm in the world, Blackstone. And so that's an example of one of the companies that I built and then I sold, and I still have a residual interest in the company. So back to, John, your question. Why do I want to do this? It's because if I'm going to do this helium company, it's going to be extraordinary. It's going to be partnership with Linde. And did I want to do it private or did I want to do it public? I chose to go the public route. Why? Because I have some extraordinary board members. One of my board members is Ian Talford. Ian Talford built one of the largest gold mining companies in the world, Gold Corp, and then he merged it with Newmont Mining. My second board member is Gordon Keep. He was one of the co-founders of Lionsgate Movie Production Company. Another board member is Diana McQueen. She was the former Mines, Energy, and Environmental Minister of Alberta, Canada. Another board member is Rob Johnson, who's a former senior vice president of Apache, which is one of the big players in the Permian Basin and worldwide exploration. And so, I'm 62 years old. What I like to do is business. I don't play golf. I have 5 sons, 4 older sons. My 4 older sons, they had an incredible mom, and so I'm remarried to another incredible mom, and I have an 8-year-old son that Matt met my son when he was in town, Ronan, and my wife, and so I don't play golf. I work over weekends. I love building businesses. And I chose to do this business to be extraordinary and to really grow this business. And so that's my passion, John, is starting, growing businesses. And again, I wasn't going to do anything subpar. This is a business that is extraordinary and will even become more extraordinary over time.
That's amazing. That's fantastic. I love that, Robert. That's cool. I think that's, the team, the people behind the business, like that's as much of the story as anything once you get into the meat of it. And I think like that idea of like, you already have so many successful businesses that you've done, and then you're not going to do a garbage business now. It's about building an extraordinary company is a phenomenal story. And I think for anybody who's like, again, approaching this from a copy or editorial standpoint, like realizing that, being able to reach out and talk to someone like Robert and actually get all the details about their history and the company and the story, like that gives you so much more material, both in your analysis and in your editorial that you write and in the promotions that you write. Like, I do think that, like, actually reaching out and building a relationship to talk to and understand the team is increasingly important for everybody involved in the business. Just like, you can't be wildly disconnected from your customer. You can't be wildly disconnected from the companies that you cover. The more you know, and the closer you get to the people who are building these companies, like, you'll get to know storylines and angles. But then you'll also, this isn't you, Robert, but there's been times that I've gotten things where this company looks great on paper, and then I met the guy, and there were times when you're like, I wouldn't trust this guy to slap me in the face. Like, and so, like, I think that personal interaction and understanding what goes into building the company and what the opportunities are, not only gives you tons of personal stories and anecdotes to write about in your editorial or the promotion, gives you tons more angles to explore when you're writing promotions and stuff. But it gives you a deeper sense of the quality of the entrepreneurs behind it, the management team, the company itself. And I think that that's something that as an industry we've overlooked as a whole, is that we've stayed too much in the basement office, not talking to people as much. And I know that, I know you, Robert, you're happy to reach out to people, or if someone reaches out to you, you're happy to talk to them, hop on a call like this or a phone and actually answer questions. And I would encourage anybody, like, this is the kind of thing you should be doing, right? Like, you should be reaching out and talking to CEOs. You should be reaching out and talking to founders. You should be on the calls, on analyst calls, whatever it is. The more you want to have a great editorial machine and a great copy machine, like, copywriters and editors should be talking to companies. And that's a lot of what I try and do now, like with what we're going to be doing in June in Baltimore, is bringing Robert in, bringing other people in, not just a handful of companies. We're very kind of selective there, but also other people who are just raising capital for companies who understand, like, how to talk about these stories, and try and build bridges for everybody between the sectors you cover and the publishing and copy teams, and get you used to talking to these people. And I'm always available to help connect people around. But I think, Robert, like with what you're building there and what you have built, it's such a beautiful company inside a really interesting sector that is driven, like the supply from that, just connected to all these massive geopolitical and macroeconomic stories. Like, it's such a cool line of exploration for us to understand. And so I love your story. I love the fact that you're, like, probably the most decent human being. Everybody, whenever we meet or I talk to anybody who's met you, they're always like, man, he's just the nicest guy in the world.
Oh, that's kind. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I can attest to that too, right? I mean, it's interesting, John, you're talking about reaching out and talking to people. I'm coming up on 2 full decades of being a market analyst, primarily in coal and iron ore and steel. But now I've been doing all this multi-commodity work for about 6-7 years now. And in the same way that when I started, I didn't know anything about coal. I didn't know anything about iron ore, like nothing. I started from absolute scratch. I was fortunate enough to have a really good mentor But I learned all of that, like all of those industries, by meeting people and talking to people, and making sure that they knew that I was completely green and I didn't really understand any of it, and any sort of additional information you could provide to help me understand things, the better off I'm going to be in the long term. And even when I met Robert last year, Robert, how much did I know about helium? Zip, absolutely nothing. And Robert was kind enough, not only to kind of show me the ropes of, well, here's how the industry is structured. Here are a few people that you could talk to about these things. And then, of course, I got 17 years of experience of typing those cold emails and reaching out to people and being, sort of consistent in contact. And then, knowing how detailed a question I can ask without, sort of overstepping my bounds. Like that comes with time, but like it goes a long way just by being, kind and gracious, to reach out and ask humble questions. Like you can't be afraid to do that. And Robert is testament to the fact that if you do that, the people who are really going to help you, you're going to wind up building, positive relationships with over a long period of time. That's how you learn things. It's how we all learn things. It's all business is people business, right?
But it's I looked at Matt as our relationship is a collaboration, because you saw the macro picture, and it was there were some parts that I just didn't see, and so us going back and forth and collaborating, you doing the deep dive on semiconductors and other parts of the supply chain. You brought it to a new level. So it really helped me out too. And I'm very appreciative of that.
Well, thanks for that. And, to John's point, like that is not sort of characteristic of the broader sort of commodity space. It's very difficult to establish those relationships over time. I mean, for me, for years, I didn't have, coal producers, steel producers, they played their cards very close to their chest. And they had regulatory issues they didn't really want to get into. So the less they talked, the better. Contrast that to when I actually started covering precious metals and some of these other spaces. Well, all of a sudden, all of these people really want to talk to you and sort of all those things. But then you wind up with the problem that especially in the mining industry, well, 99% of those companies are going to be worth zero after a long period of time. So you have to understand how to separate the wheat from the chaff. And that's a much longer process. But one of the things that separates the haves from the have-nots is serially successful entrepreneurs. And in my experience, the folks who've had the most success in their careers are also some of the kindest and best folks to learn from. And you certainly fall into that category, and appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you. But Matt, you did the work. You reached out because helium was such an opaque market. You can't really look at indexes. You talked to the experts with Phil Kornbluth and others, and looked anyway. You really did the work. And again, I learned from you very much. Thank you.
Well, thanks. But that's kind of what John's point is, right? Is like you have to be able to put yourself on the line a little bit and get a little bit outside your comfort zone in order to learn these things. If whether you're working in editorial or with copy, and certainly John and I are resources to the entire industry to that regard. But at the end of the day, like all the information comes from the folks who have the boots on the ground.
Yeah,
for real.
I think people just don't think about it. Like I was coming up when I was a copywriter, like it never occurred to me. It just didn't occur to me that I could talk to the CEO of a company that was going to be covered in the portfolio that an editor was doing. Like it didn't even occur to me. And I think that doesn't occur to most people in the industry, that like, hey, wait a second, like you can actually reach out and they will pick up the phone. They will email back. They will answer you. They will give you time, because everybody wants anybody who's interested in being in covering a company, they're going to get time to, especially if they're a smaller cap company, because there isn't anybody out there covering.
And it's fun to talk with people with inquisitive minds. I love it, because you learn, as I said, it's a two-way street. You learn back and forth. Yeah.
And so for everybody, just to kind of wrap this up around, this idea of kind of looking at past promos, looking at themes, looking at big macro stories, news stories, the things that we know grab attention, and drilling it down to a sector story, into a company story. That's a big part of what I'm trying to push back because I have talked to a lot of people, including, Amber over at the CEO over at MarketWise. I've talked to a bunch of publishers in the space, both on the Agora side and outside. And this is a persistent issue that everyone is recognizing, that there are not as much experienced folks who know how to tell market stories, know how to tell stories that are not just about giant games, and actually be able to tell the actual investment story in an exciting, interesting way. And so I'm really kind of super excited about the fact that in June here in Baltimore, not only we have Robert coming, we have Matt coming, we have a bunch of other folks coming. I'm an advisor on a company that Mona Defrawi is on, that she's raised $15 billion in various things over the years. And she's coming to just talk about some of her bigger ideas. But I'm actually, as a FinPub copy geek, I'm extraordinarily excited that Kelly Brown and Mike Palmer have reached out and asked to come and kind of be involved a little bit. Because we have two of the greatest copy chiefs in the history of the industry coming. And they're specifically coming for ideas just like this. They want to talk about ideas. They want to explore ideas. And we're going to have some really interesting conversations about how do you take stories and ideas like this and turn them into promo, turn them into editorial. How does this actually help? Because again, everyone recognizes that we live or die by our ideas. And so that's why I'm so excited to have Robert here, because he's such a good example of not just a great company, but a great company that the more you dig into it, the more stories and angles that are actually impressive and interesting you find. And the fact that he knows things about his sector that you and I don't know. Who ever heard of a Saudi Arabia of helium, right? You have to get that from someone like Robert on the ground. And that's a whole headline right there. There's a whole promo there. Anyone who's a copy geek like me, you probably heard a dozen ideas in here, but that I didn't pull out. And that to me is what makes this business, is part of what makes FinPub great. Is Robert, you love talking about the intellectual curiosity, or people who are intellectually curious. And FinPub is the reason most of us, I think, love this business, besides the fact that it can be a great cash machine, is it is so intellectually stimulating because of these intersections and the people that we can talk to, and having access to someone like Robert to talk about helium and to talk about his other mining experience and the relationships that he has. And he has a deep well of experience that we didn't even get into here. And that's part of what I'm doing, is trying to put people like Robert in the room with you in order to be able to talk and build these relationships and find these stories. And so I want to thank you, Robert, for coming today. Matt, thank you as always for all of your help. This to me has been a phenomenal conversation, and I hope for everybody else it's kind of a teaser about how we're going to be having these conversations in a few weeks.
Good. I'm looking forward to seeing both you guys in a few short weeks in June.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. It's going to be fun. Always good to see you. And so thanks again, and have a great rest of the week.
Okay. Thanks. See you, John. See you,
Thanks,
Matt.
John.
Bye-bye. Okay. Bye.